Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2022 Povey Lecture, which this year is entitled The Building Safety Act, Practical Steps for Compliance in Construction. I thought I'd start by reminding everybody why this is the Povey Lecture. So the loved and late Philip Povey was working with the JCT and was very instrumental in the developments of the contract and actually a lot of the drafting between 1951 and 1998. It seems an incredibly long time to be involved with the contract. And this series of lectures was set up in his memory, and we have the privilege of being here with you today to commemorate him through these lectures. So we have a slightly different format this year. Gary Neal, Head of Fire at Skanska UK, will speak about fire safety and the Building Safety Act, as is the normal process, and we will after that have a panel discussion, and we'll be joined by Amanda Long, who has got her Building a Safer Future hat on today, and we hope that you'll find it a stimulating discussion. It's certainly a topic of very great interest to all of us in the industry now. So I'd like to ask Gary to go up to the lectern and begin his talk.
Thank you, Karen. Firstly, Karen, thank you for inviting me to such an important event. To be plucked out of obscurity to share my thoughts on any topic is an unexpected honour. As you will gather when we go through my presentation today, I come to this from a practical perspective, and this comes out of many years in an industry that I'm proud to say I'm very happy to be part of. My day-to-day role is to represent Skanska as Head of Fire, Design and Delivery, and I focus on management controls, leadership, guidance, advice and training. And I've enjoyed over 40 years in construction with, I would say, over 30 years in fire safety. Unfortunately, my move into fire came about as a result of the 1987 King's Cross fire. And I'm sure that event spawned many similar careers. A very public fire with significant avoidable loss of life became the wake-up call for change, and now our underground systems are amongst the safest in the world. But like all significant events, time passes and memories fade until in the early hours of June 2017, disaster struck once again. As we all know, back in June 2017, a devastating fire engulfed the Grenfell Tower block in Kensington, and the building burned for several hours, and 72 people eventually were confirmed to have lost their life. This was a direct result of a relatively minor fire reaching the open cavity formed behind the cladding, and that cavity included combustible insulation. Fire was able to spread uncontrolled to engulf most of the upper floors, and several hours later Grenfell was still alight as the insulation burned uncontrollably. So what have we learned from another fire disaster? I think it's fair to say the most likely cause was the failure to apply the most basic elements of the building regulations, and just as importantly, approve document B. The conclusions that are being drawn indicate that the terrible outcome was down to inadequate design, wrong product selection and poor installation. And that seems to me that the responsible person failed to employ competent persons to provide those important fire elements. If consideration of the original compartment lines had been reviewed when the cladding was considered, and the guidance in approved document B applied, there may have been a different outcome, and the cladding may not have been so haphazardly fitted. But importantly, if adequate quality controls and inspections were in place when the works were carried out, it would have been clear to building control and the fire authorities that life safety had been compromised and action could have been taken. Government and the industry realised things had to change, and a top to bottom review started, driven by the Hackett Review. The Building Safety Act 2022 came into law. The Building Safety Act has four main areas of focus: changes to general building safety rules, introduction of a new regime for higher risk buildings, changes to the fire safety regime, and extension of limitation periods, which came into force on June 2022. Let's consider each in a little more detail. So, changes to the general building safety rules. My focus here is on competence, or to put it another way, incompetence, which may be the root cause of Grenfell. All too often we take it for granted that those who work with us and who put themselves forward as experts are competent. And we have a reluctance to challenge, ask for evidence and check the track record. We would do this as a matter of course when we say book a holiday or a meal, but we go headlong into construction with hardly any checks in place. Well, at least that seems to be the case with Grenfell, as this was a major finding of the inquiry. So what is competence? Competence, as the government guidance tells us, is the combination of training, skills, experience and knowledge that a person has and their ability to apply them to perform a task safely. Judith Hackett, she said, the essence of competence is relevance to the workplace. What matters is that there is a proper focus on both the risks that occur most often and those with serious consequences. Competence is the ability for every director, manager and worker to recognise the risks in operational activities and then apply the right measures to control and manage those risks. It's therefore our overriding obligation to make sure that competence is measured at all levels, and where gaps appear, we fill those gaps with training, guidance and monitoring. So point two, the introduction of a new regime for higher risk buildings. A key point to notice here is the mention of higher risk buildings. So that doesn't just mean high rise buildings, and already I'm becoming aware of this as a misunderstanding. The Building Safety Act applies to all construction in all sectors. We just know that high-rise resi comes directly under the new Building Safety Regulator regime, but subject to review, the regulator may bring in whatever is considered appropriate. For us in construction, the significant change will alter the way we engage with building control and approved inspectors. It will also put steps in place to stop the practice to build before we design and finish before we complete. Now that sounds very odd in practice, but in truth, that's the way construction for far too long has been carried out. Under the new regime, construction won't start until everything necessary is in place and it can be demonstrated to the regulator that a competent team have designed the works based on tested, certified and approved products and solutions. Then once works commence, all involved must be able to demonstrate competence in delivering their element of work. This will mean a far higher level of inspections and reviews at every stage of the work, and the Building Safety Regulator will be looking for evidence of certification, accreditation and inspection throughout the build process. This will of course bring on a high level of cost. However, when considered against the cost of poor quality and remedial works, the commercial impact will be insignificant as we drive to a right first time platform. Another key element will be the final sign-off of higher risk buildings. At the moment, project completion, usually known as PC, is largely a commercial position to trigger commencement of defects periods and retention release. This often has little reference to the practical state of the works. We've all seen projects running on past PC with part occupation in unfinished buildings. The new regime will put an end to this practice as an occupation certificate will be required. And a key part of this will be the provision of accurate records of compliance and certification. Providing this information has been part of building regulations for many, many years under Regulation 38, and it's set out clearly in Approved Document B. Unfortunately, this has largely been ignored, leaving the owner and user of a building often ignorant of the safety measures in place. And as the building is occupied and the inevitable changes are made over time, this can lead to users unwittingly moving away from the original safe and compliant building to an unsafe situation. The new role of accountable person identifies the individual who has a responsibility for the safe upkeep of the building and taking the lead in continuing assessment required to demonstrate fitness for occupation. But this can only be successfully achieved if they've got accurate records handed over at the point of completion. So let's look at point 3, changes to the fire safety regime. The government continues to consult on changes to the fire safety order, and the fire safety order regulates workplaces and the non-domestic parts of flats. There is a potential for overlapping responsibilities of accountable persons under the Act and responsible persons under the fire safety order. And this will be particularly evident in mixed-use buildings containing residential flats and other areas such as offices at home and homes. But this is a positive move because as we see again mention of an accountable person, but also we're bringing in a responsible person, this will bring together the Building Safety Act and the Fire Safety Order, and it will look for cooperation from all parties. We are all well aware of the need to carry out risk assessments of a building during occupation. However, in the past it has been shown that some of those carrying out this crucial role have been inadequately qualified and experienced. And we see competency again being mentioned as the overriding theme in the Building Safety Act. So the adequate provision of information in line with Regulation 38 is an essential part of the risk assessment process, as without it there will be no suitable starting point that has any meaning. Under the Building Safety Act, the accountable person is mentioned as a person who holds legal estate in possession of the common parts, or a person who has a relevant repairing obligation of the common part. The responsible person under the Regulatory Reform Order is a person who has control over a premises as the owner, occupier or employer. So very similar outcomes, very similar roles with the same outcome to provide and maintain a fire safe environment. We can also consider the Fire Safety England Regulations 2022, which come into force in January 2023. These regulations are made under the Regulatory Reform Order and specifically bring ADB, Approved Document B, into that order and combines that with the duties of the responsible person with regard to relevant information for the fire and rescue services and control of the fire doors in residential communal areas. So here we see two orders, two roles being brought together to give us a safer environment and a safer future for people who live in the buildings we create. So point 4, the extended limitation periods which came into force on June 2022. This is one for the legal experts amongst you, but on a practical note, it means we are responsible for longer, and for those living in defective premises are better protected. The aim is to end the situation whereby leaseholders are left to pick up the tab for the failure of those responsible to carry out and correctly apply the building regulations. I mentioned earlier the Building Safety Regulator, and that sets out some key gateway points that affect construction. Under the Building Safety Regulator, there's 3 gateways: Gateway 1, Gateway 2, Gateway 3. Gateway 1 comes into play in the planning application. It's part of the permission granted by the local planning authority in consultation with the Building Safety Regulator, and this is at the point at which the Building Safety Regulator may bring in construction other than high-rise residential under control of the new regime. That aligns generally with the RIBA stage 2 to 3. Once plan permission has been granted, a safety case prepared and Gateway 1 passed, we're given the authority to go ahead into the design stage. That would typically be the RIBA stage 4, and the regulator calls that Gateway phase 2. That's a submitted design confirming construction meets requirements of the building regulations and approved documents. It's competently produced and complete before we can build, without huge sections of the fire safe design elements pushed out as contractors' design portions into the construction phase. Gateway 2 considers structural fire safety requirements, general structural safety requirements, construction materials and workmanship. And subject to meeting all those requirements, the Building Safety Regulator may give permission to start construction and a risk-based inspection programme agreed. Work starts, and that's considered generally to be the RIBA stage 5. That brings into play the new legislation framework where the Building Safety Regulator, under a combination of the HSE, the Fire Authority and Building Control, will start to oversight and consider the construction phase. That construction phase should be based on appointment of UCAS accredited third-party contractors to complete all fire elements. This is part of the regulatory reform order. Employ competent people. The responsible person employs competent people. A measure of competence is UCAS third-party accreditation. We must have a detailed quality assurance strategy with an approved inspection and test plan for all activities. That inspection and test plan would include samples, benchmarking, agreed inspections, monitoring and managing. All those things that seem to have fell to the wayside at Grenfell. Samples weren't provided, benchmarking wasn't undertaken, quality control wasn't managed. And then part of this process through construction is record keeping, and a strategy must be approved and implemented. So then we've driven through construction, we're almost at the home straight, and we want to occupy. Gateway 3. The Building Safety Regulator will assess whether the duty holder has created a building that meets the Gateway 2 intentions, or has made controlled and justifiable changes. Part of that Gateway 3 is the provision of the fire safety information. I remind you that's under Regulation 38 of the building regulations. Looking forward, we've recently seen the publication of a British standard document on the digitalisation of fire safety information. Going forward, that's likely to become a significant part of construction. We should all be looking at the framework set out in that standard and thinking how that impacts on us and how we can incorporate that into our works. But those record keeping, that essential record keeping, needs to be started at the start of construction, not a mad scramble at the end of construction to pull together sometimes inadequate and inappropriate information. So that process to collect information needs to start at the design phase. And then as the building's occupied, it starts to live its life, there'll be constant safety case reviews. That aligns quite clearly with RRBA Stage 7, where the Building Safety Regulator will assess at regular intervals whether the duty holder is taking precautions to reduce building safety risk so far as reasonably practicable, and in particular whether the safety case file includes information on the building safety management systems, records, maintenance and testing, updated Regulation 38 documents, a current and accurate fire risk assessment, and a resident engagement strategy. So we come now, just as a summary, the key points for construction and things that we as constructors should think about. First and clear point is check projects are building regulations compliant. That seems quite obvious, but it's often not something that's achieved. We need to keep in mind that building regulations and approved documents are the minimum standards, not the maximum. So when I see strategies and proposals put in front of me that almost meet the requirements of building regulations, almost meet the requirements of approved documents, I don't pass those. I don't accept those because those documents are minimum standards. So when we shave a few metres off this, a few air changes per minute off of that, we're actually already working against something that was a minimum standard. So let's make sure we reach and achieve building regulations. We need to appoint an approved fire engineer. There's many fire engineers out in the industry today, and they've all got good, relevant experience. But is it relevant to the project you're building? If that excellent fire engineer has spent a career looking after airports and you're building a high-rise residential building, clearly not appropriate, probably not competent. So look at the fire engineer you're employing, look at their track record, check their PI insurance, check their past documents that they've produced, make sure they're the right person for you. Look at your design and make sure it's fully compliant and coordinated before you start delivering that design, before you start working out of it, before you start constructing it. I see many designs which fall short of fully compliant and coordinated. Employ only UCAS third-party accredited specialists to carry out the works. This ensures you've got the right people with the right skills and knowledge, the right training. They will meet your expectations and they will deliver a competent and compliant building. Use only fire products that come with adequate certification. I see many examples of certification which is inadequate, inappropriate and ill-judged. Old, out of date, complies with out-of-date standards. It's not acceptable. We need to dig deep into that certification information and make sure we've got the right products. And then whatever we're doing, record it as we do it and provide our Regulation 38 compliant information and provide that to the building user. When we need to remember that the Building Safety Act applies to all construction and not just high-rise buildings. At Skanska, our direction is clear and our internal procedures ensure we are business ready to deliver compliance with the Building Safety Act for all construction and not just high-rise buildings. But what this really comes down to is culture. Fire safety and delivering excellence is at the heart of Skanska and drives everything we do. For those of us who keep this in mind, it is likely we will never feel the breath of the Building Safety Act upon us, leaving those in our wake to suffer the long-term implications. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gary. So now we'll turn to the panel discussion, and this is an opportunity for your own questions, which you can type in on the space provided. Just to say, there will be plenty of opportunity. I imagine there's a lot of you out there. There will be a lot of questions. There will be an opportunity to have your questions answered, even if we can't fit them in this session. So we're going to have a follow-up on the JCT website to answer some of your questions, which we didn't manage to review this afternoon. So the first thing I'd like to do is to turn to Amanda and ask her for her reactions to what Gary's just said.
Right, well, thanks very much, Karen. I'd really like to sort of build on some of what Gary had to say. I thought you did a great job of taking us through some of the sort of framework that sort of everyone's facing now and needs to work with. I think my build probably is on the final point. It's about culture and really about culture and leadership. It was quite interesting to me when you started to speak, Gary, you talked about King's Cross and that, you know, that was a major hazard accident that happened in rail. We saw the same sort of things happen in the chemical sector with Bunsfield, oil and gas, you know, Piper Alpha, all of these major hazard events, and those industries have really had to learn from those, have had to learn how to embrace and deal with major hazard safety. And actually, I think the challenge and the opportunity for the built environment sector is about embracing major hazard safety. So the built environment sector, construction sector, are really good at managing occupational health and safety. That's that sort of business as usual. It's been something that's really become embedded into the industry. But actually, major hazard risk management is, relatively speaking, in terms of the consciousness of the industry, something that is new, very below the surface at best, and it's really embracing that whole piece is what's going to matter, because you can have the systems and process in place to deal with, have we got competence in place, have we got the right strategy, have we got the system and processes that support some of the key points that came out of Dame Judith Hackett's report in terms of managing change or audit and risk or managing construction products. You can have all of those things in place, but if you haven't got the right behaviours, leadership and culture in place that is actually putting managing major hazard risk first, managing, in this case, building safety first, that's the major hazard risk that this conversation is really about. If you haven't got that in place, then actually all of the systems and processes, whilst they're there, they're not part of the behaviours of what the industry is actually delivering on. So for me, I think it's a bit of a build on what Gary has said, starting really with his final point around culture and that need to have the right culture and leadership in place. And I think it's very new for the industry. And we've seen over the last sort of couple of years, the industry, I think, be quite sort of slow to engage with the need to really change culture and leadership and put building safety first. And some of that has been articulated around waiting for regulation to come. But the regulation is in place. And of course, the argument can be, well, we've got to wait for the secondary legislation. Well, I think that actually we're some years on from Grenfell and we need to start seeing real change. So it's culture and leadership for me, Karen.
I mean, I've got an observation there, which is the thing I particularly remember about the day after the Grenfell fire, quite apart from the horrendous shock and all of us shaking our heads and saying this can't happen in a modern building when clearly it can. But I can't forget the fact that when I try and encourage people to think about these issues, I can't forget that the day after the fire, The Guardian produced what was effectively a complete project directory of every single person, consultants, contractors, whoever, on the project team for the Grenfell works, whether or not they did turn out to be implicated. Yeah. So all those parties had their reputations potentially trashed, tried in the court of the press and public opinion. And so whatever else, you would think after this time that the reputational force of these things would motivate people. But you're saying that we're very much behind the curve compared to other industries.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, when following Dame Judith Hackett's report being published, there was a sort of call for change, obviously, and I mean, I think the industry in all sorts of ways have gone sort of long and deep into how to address the points that were raised out of that report. But absolutely central to that report was 53 recommendations, but an absolute core recommendation was the industry needs to move from a build it fast, build it cheap culture. And really embrace putting building safety first. Now, rail, oil and gas, nuclear, chemicals are all industries that they still have lots and lots of problems. Let's not imagine there's perfection anywhere, because there isn't. But there are substantial system, process, culture, behaviours and leadership in place to really embrace that. We are a major hazard industry, and there is major hazard risk in what we do. How do we manage that? In construction, I think that acknowledgement of we are an industry that has major hazard risk to manage does not go so deep or so broad in terms of real understanding and engagement with it. And it's one of the reasons why we created the Building a Safer Future champion process, which is a whole piece that actually was drawn from work that was done in all of those other sectors. How do we looked at what had happened following those disasters, Bunsfield in chemicals, Piper Alpha. What did they do to help their industry get hold of this concept of major hazard risk and start to develop leadership and culture that could manage it? And they brought in cultural maturity scales and sort of tools that help organisations really dig deep into this and understand what's going on in my organisation, because you might have a fantastic organisation that has all the systems and processes that are required, but the question is, do people understand it? Are they doing it? When it comes to a worry on a job that something isn't being done right, is the right culture in place to be able to stop that
to
job?
empower the person to speak.
Precisely, yeah, and you can't empower someone unless they actually understand it. And Gary, in his lecture, quite rightly commented on competence, and competence actually being as much about understanding, about managing risk and understanding risk. Well, that whole major hazard piece needs to be in there, and it is new for the industry, and we are behind the curve. Those other sectors are much more on top of sort of embracing this concept of how we manage major hazard risk and create the right culture and leadership. This industry is slow about it.
That's slightly concerning this many years. There's a point I want to revisit in what you said, Gary. I was very interested in what you said about the gateways and certification. So can I posit a sort of instant case study to you? I was interested and not a little amused when you talked about practical completion or sectional completion being a commercial driver. So a typical office refurbishment or new build office, the completions, the sectional completions, the parts of the building that are made available or partially occupied, it might very much be driven by which pre-let is them being emphasised as being the next priority. Are you able to describe how that the approach might change now, given the need for the gateways and certification?
So if you think about it, it's okay to allow for part occupation of a building, because nothing generally completes in a large building at the same point. However, for a tenant to occupy a given floor, is the fire alarm system fully complete? Is it fully operational? Are the sprinkler systems fully complete and operational? Is all the compartmentation in the building complete? Are the safe exit routes available? Are the fire escape lifts available? All of those elements that were described in the fire strategy, are they all available? And if they are, then it sounds to me like it's safe to occupy. But if we've got some part completion, some work still in progress, then that's an unsafe building, and that gap between that part completion and that completion is often a gap, a space where we're occupying a building and it's just not ready.
Well, we've all seen the exposed struts in
We've all seen
buildings
that.
because somebody wants the rental period to start in a particular part of a building.
I walk past, when I come back from the station most days, I go past a new housing development, and there's people living in those housing units, and the construction's still ongoing. How they get in or out, I've no idea, but they won't become fully safe until the whole development's complete. And I think the gateways are going to control that.
And when you say competency is the key, absolute key watchword for all of this, from a practical point of view, if you're choosing, I'm assuming that this applies to everybody, including all the designers, the principal designer for CDM, that your contractor, etc. When you're doing your due diligence and you're looking for assessing relevant competency, because I think you're saying it is relevant competency. You don't want somebody who builds bridges to build a housing estate. From a practical point of view, how would you actually assess that?
I think you've got to look at track records. As I mentioned in my lecture, we're quite happy to do a lot of deep dive digging if we're booking hotels and restaurants and so on. We don't do anything like enough checks when we're employing people because they're named and badged as consultants. So it's about looking at what the business stands for, understanding the business culture, what sort of projects they've worked on in the past, the volume, the size, what's their staff attitude to work, what's their future plan, what training regimes have they got in place, how are they managing their works, and what can they bring to a project to really excel, really make it deliver excellence.
I think that's a super important point. When you were talking about it, I was delighted. I think you're dead right. You know, it's that sort of thinking. It's the whole point about relevance. Well, that comes from an understanding of I'm dealing with major hazard risk here. I can't just say that'll do. You know, let's have that person in the door because they happen to be the most local and the cheapest. Let's go for that. We've actually got to go for the expertise that's relevant and that thought that you've just expressed and the system and process that goes behind that due diligence, as well as the thinking and understanding of what's being done, is what's absolutely key.
And let's have the conversation. We shouldn't be embarrassed or slow coming forward to have the conversation, and let's engage properly and know what we're buying and really set our expectations very clearly.
And do you think every project of whatever size, apart from de minimis, needs, this is a common discussion point in the industry, a massive urban regeneration project or infrastructure project will have typically a risk register, but to a certain extent, if we all had the risk register, nothing would ever get built, and we're like, just, you know, averting our gaze, please don't show me a risk register. Do you think that that is going to bring risk registers and risk assessments more to the fore, generally?
Again, I believe the risk register has become an overworked document. I think it lives in a separate world from practical solutions. Thinking about, does this really work? Does that fit? Can we buy it? Can we build it? And can we certify it? There's simple ideas. Buy, build, certify. If we can do all of those things, we've probably got a good solution. And we see things that, again, sit on a risk register, they tend to be tilted towards commercial risk.
I like that, because you can have it on a slogan and behind the Prime Minister's lectern, really, can't you? The 3-word slogan.
Buy, build, certify.
But I think it has to be couched in a real understanding of what you're actually buying, building and certifying. And that's where the whole piece about the residents' engagement, the residents' voice really matters, informing the thinking of the design of the work that's going to be done, which was absolutely key from Dame Judith Hackett's report. It is about the culture of the organisation, not buying, building and certifying it as quickly, as easy and as cheaply as we can, but actually
I was going to ask, does it inevitably mean costing more and taking longer?
No.
Well, I think if you start thinking about the potential for prosecutions, there'll be great
penny wise and pound foolish.
Yes, precisely. I would. You said no, Gary. I agree.
Yeah.
I think that's a mindset piece.
I think you're right. You've only got to take a very basic look at the cost of poor quality. It will generally cost you 10% of your cost to do it correctly, a minimal cost to do it correctly, because let's face it, eventually you are going to do it correctly. You can either do it right first time, or you can go and do it 3 or 4 iterations of the same job and eventually get it right.
Well, the cost is out there, as I said, the front page of the Guardian after the Grenfell fire. Ultimately that's the real cost.
And that is the
not
cost,
doing
yeah,
it.
the commercial damage,
And
reputational damage.
also, if you look at the work of the Get It Right initiative, Building a Safer Future Charter works a lot with Gary, and actually there's a great deal of cost, not just in reputation, but actually in just getting the job done
Can
properly.
you
in the
explain a bit
first
more
instance.
about that, please?
So literally having the right people doing the job with the right materials in the right
But the
way.
initiative.
Oh, the Get It Right initiative.
Yes.
Oh, well, you'd have to get Cliff, who's the chief executive, on to talk about that. But it's a very interesting initiative that got set up a few years ago by a group of individuals from the construction sector who started to look at what really is the cost of not doing things properly right first time, and they've actually gone about putting a real financial label on it. And showing, well, actually, when you're having to redo work or where you're not dealing with issues such as sustainability properly in the first instance, putting that thought in early on in the whole process, actually you're losing money and costing your organisation right the way through the process when actually you could be saving it. So that's where Gary sort of developed, and I think they've gone from about sort of 10 individuals to, I think it's about 300 they've got who are actually
We can put a link to these organisations
Yes,
in
please do.
in the
Please do.
the post lecture notes on the JCT website.
GIRI. So do put that in, because they're a really interesting group, and Building a Safer Future does work with them.
And to put it another way, doing it right first time is really cheap.
Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
Relatively speaking.
That's the point.
Compared to doing it wrong.
Yeah, that's exactly.
So I think I've got now to turn to audience questions. So John Griffiths is asking, touching upon something that I asked about when we had our initial discussion about doing this session. What changes to the design and build procurement process will be required to accommodate the new legislation, and what amendments do the panel believe are required to the JCT standard contract? I think probably it's very unfair to ask you the second, particularly since JCT has not quite yet decided what to do, because it's waiting for the final versions of the regulations to land. So JCT will inform you in due course about what it's decided to do to the JCT contract. But the first part, I think that's a valid question. What change to the design and build procurement process will be required?
So procurement in any build process is very, very important, but we've got to make sure that we're allowing our procurement teams to buy the right products with the right specification for the right purpose. Cost is always an important part of construction, but as long as we're buying, we're spending our money wisely, and we know what our outcome looks like, that's the time when our procurement people can come and work, do their magic, get some savings, but against the right product, something we can buy, build and certify. So it's just a change in mindset. It's not about what's cheapest, it's not a drive to the bottom. We know what happens when we do that. We end up with a Grenfell. We need to get our design right, get our product right, understand what we're doing, what we're delivering, and then we get our price right.
And some of it is around that word collaborative. We often hear, you know, the discussion about collaborative, and I've heard a lot over the last couple of years around should there be more collaborative procurement? And Dr. David Mosey Professor David Mosey recently put out a collaborative procurement set of guidelines, which was about really engaging that other party in the discussion, making sure there was that relevance, making sure that it was a fair and appropriate conversation, making sure that both parties were getting what they should be getting from the process, so that you get away from that build it fast, build it cheap sort of approach that we've had in the past.
And when we were discussing this the other day, I almost inferred, although I'm not quite sure, that was what you were suggesting. a sort of slight bias towards two-stage D&B, where you involve the D&B contractor under a PCSA and under the earlier development design stages?
I think you're right, Karen. We've got to start. We've got to stop looking at packages, build packages in isolation. We've got to look at the composite. You know, what are we delivering here? Bring in all of the specialist trades on as early as possible, earlier than we ever thought necessary. Work with that expertise, understand what the challenges they face, and then start to build on that. And I from my own experience, know where we do that, we already know what our outcome looks like. Our costs are easier to fix, our design's clearer, and the commercial outcome will absolutely be stronger.
But just to emphasise, this is a practical approach that fits the small fit out as much as the large new build project. It's as a way of thinking.
It's a different way of thinking now, and just we can no longer push what looks like a simple, easy element to the back end of a job. Fire elements in a whole construction process, big or small, amount to a very small part of that overall spend, often seen as barely significant. But the outcome is huge. Disproportionate to the spend. So there's always value at any size project to just think about what we're doing. And like I said, I come to this from a practical approach. I like to think, have we got the right people, the right contracts in place, the right products, and do we all understand what we're doing? And you can apply that to anything, you know, whatever we do. If we don't really understand what our outcome is, it'll always be poor.
Yeah, and it's that understanding, it goes back to the beginning of the conversation about really understanding major hazard risk. The problem with major hazard risk is you were talking about a rare occasion, thank goodness, but with terrible consequences, rather than occupational health and safety, where you have often terrible consequences, or can be terrible consequences, but they might be smaller incidences. So they're quite different things. And the mindset in the sector is really understanding and able to manage the occupational health and safety piece, but that major hazard piece, because it's not yet embedded in the mindset, we do still have the problem that you're raising, Karen. Are we talking about something that really can only be embraced if you're talking about a major project, even down, you know, rather than at a small fit out? And it is that mindset, that understanding, that culture, that means that when we say, do we understand what we're doing, it's, do we really understand what we're doing, including the major hazard elements, so that even though it might be something, as you say, small, relative to the cost of the job on fire safety, the implications of failure of it is disproportionate. And there's that understanding of that.
And if we think about a small fit out, so that's a really dangerous place, a small fit out, because that's often done so the major construction piece is completed, there's been some changes, a small fit out in time, and that's where that lack of record keeping has its real impact, because that fit out contractor will start from the wrong place. They're on the wrong page before they even start. The records that were handed over may have been complete, and that 2-hour firewall that goes across a floor plate, if that's not mentioned clear and obvious, the building owner might think, I can let those two spaces as one space. All of a sudden, door appears in that wall.
Surely you're not suggesting that the health and safety file is ever incomplete, Gary?
I've probably just been really unlucky.
Right.
Because that's my experience.
So this is a question that we touched on when we were discussing earlier, possibly based on the same misconception that I demonstrated to you. Will there be a gap between a building reaching practical completion under the contract and the regulator providing the separate certificate to permit occupation? And who is going to manage, ensure and secure the building during that period? So visions of us twiddling all our thumbs when it's actually otherwise ready for occupation.
Okay, so if we don't start the job in the right place, if we don't start our information folder during design, if we pay little attention to the quality control of a building, if we don't plan what completion looks like before we even start the work, yeah, there will definitely be a gap. But if we do it right, if we understand what completion looks like before we start. And this is something that's often not really managed very well. We should never start any item of work until we know what completion looks like, because my idea of completion may be different from someone else's, and that's where we'll get to that end and we haven't really finished when we thought we were. So now we need to close that gap, plan completion before we start the work, and come down to that point where we're ready to hand over. The building safety regulators come on that journey with us, so the collaboration's there, and I think that'll be a smooth transition into occupation.
But do they have the resources to react quickly if they've been warned in advance that that's when they're being required to
I think that to answer your question there, Karen, is I think they will have resources because they'll co-opt in resources from existing approved inspectors and existing organisations. And I think that's the intention, that's my understanding, the intention.
Thinking about passports and driving licences.
I understand. I think it was just left to the building safety regulator direct. There's a potential problem there. But as I say, I think they're already planning. We've seen consultations out on external charges. We're all able to look at and say our piece on what those external charges would look like. So the building safety regulator can establish at the start whether they're going to deliver that regime directly or they're going to co-opt in another existing approved inspector organisation. We know what those charges are going to be like, and I think it's just about planning.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a good point. For regulation, it's very hard. The resources are always limited, and the requirement, you know, for what they're facing is huge. So I do think that there are risks for the regulator in terms of just keeping up with the workload, especially as everything is introduced. I think what we've seen so far, as I think Gary is suggesting, I think we've seen a really good, careful approach to trying to shape their work and how they'll respond as the regulation was put together, the Act was put together, and then also now being part of the secondary legislation discussion. So I think we're seeing a really good response to it, and I think a realistic response to it, given that we know that regulators are always in that situation where they haven't got enough resource or they have cuts in resource, but actually they're having to keep up with a really difficult agenda.
And who are these people? Are they individual civil servants, or are they people who've been brought in from the relevant specialisms who would otherwise be in the market?
Definitely people have been brought in from the relevant specialisms. But we must keep in mind we've got a building control system that works at the moment. We've got some building regulations that we should be delivering at the moment. We're just tinkering with how those are how the regime is managed. Just because the regulator may not be ready, it doesn't mean that we don't need to deliver our buildings in readiness. You raised a point earlier, Amanda, about people who are waiting for the new regulation to come out. There are no new regulations. No. People say this to me all the time. I'm not aware of what they are. There's building regulations. Can we please get on and deliver building regulations? Then you'll never find yourself in trouble with the building safety regulator.
And I mean, you're right. You know, if you look at the building safety regulator that's being developed using engaging with the HSE and it being in-housed within the HSE, there is expertise, really substantial expertise in there, and resource in there that their work. I think there's a lot of good work being done across the joint sort of regulatory discussions with the local authority building control to try and knit together the regulatory story so that it can be managed properly. I think it is being done, and there's certainly been some frustration in the industry. Oh, is this moving fast enough? How is this going to be done? But I do think it's actually being done very carefully.
I think so.
And I think we've got to give it the chance to be able to get themselves set up and rolled out. And I think we can expect resource blips. I think it would be unfair not to expect that. It's a hell of a big job they're facing.
So theoretically, there could be a bit of a hiatus.
I think it's really important that industry should be taking responsibility and doing what it should be doing regardless of the regulator, and then the regulator needs to be getting itself in place to be able to make its checks on that, but one shouldn't be waiting for the other. It should be done anyway.
Absolutely. That's the strong point there. Let's not wait for the regulator, let's just deliver it.
Get on and do it.
Now, this is a slightly different question. So, do you think there's a tension between meeting the twin obligations of the BSA changes and net zero? Is there a tension there? Can they interact?
I think they ought to be complementary. The reality is, certainly when it comes to sort of leadership and culture on building safety, that leadership and culture, which is a much more collaborative culture where individuals have a greater responsibility and accountability for what they're doing, I think that could mesh just as well in with the carbon net zero agenda as it does with the building safety agenda. I don't think one's more important than the other, and it doesn't need to be expressed that way. I think and it's quite interesting if you look at DLUC and you look at the titles of the individuals in DLUC who are responsible for the building safety work. Generally, they're all within a department which is about safer, greener buildings. So I think there's the thinking there that these agendas
Safer and greener, yes.
Safer and greener. So there's opportunity there for those agendas to come together. I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. I think they could potentially work together. There will be points where they don't work, but that will be to understand and work around.
I think we all make a commitment. If we all make a commitment to only ever do construction tasks the once, surely that is a massive impact. Massive impact on all the environmental measures we're looking at. Because we do things 3 or 4 times, we're burning through resources, producing more carbon.
Absolutely.
So if we just did that, that has to work.
This next question is really one for me. So it's Mark Patton says, will the JCT incorporate the regulator requirements for a building safety case and to enable the building owners to obtain a building insurance certificate to occupy rather than stop at practical completion? I think that sort of issue belongs in the scope documents, not in the contract amendments. As you will all know out there, as JCT fans, JCT does not define practical completion, but it's open to you to set out a set of specific deliverables along with building regulations, fire approvals, etc., in your scope document, which indeed you should. Right. Is REBA Stage 4 design information required to achieve Gateway 2 approval? This is probably from an architect, I would imagine. For D&B contracts, work on site usually commences prior to REBA Stage 4 being completed. Gary, I think you did refer to things needing to be more developed before work starts.
Yeah, before work starts, we've got a practice of a well-worn phrase, contractor's design portion. That appears to me to be anything that the design consultants don't really understand that gets kicked down the road in construction. We need to just stop that. Let's make sure before we start a job we've designed it properly, we understand what we're doing and we can deliver it correctly. And I think that's what Gateway 2 is looking at. Are you really ready to start? It's design and build. It's not build and design, is it?
Preferably. I'm afraid that's probably going to be all the time we've got for questions. But just to say, as I referred to earlier, do not despair, because we have many, many questions that we've not managed to get through, and those will hopefully be answered in our post-lecture wrap-up on the JCT website. So thank you very much for attending today and listening to this talk, and I hope it's been enriching. I certainly have found it very interesting and stimulating. Thank you very much to Gary, and thank you very much to Amanda, and I'd like them to feel free to give us information about their respective organisations and the bodies that they referred to in the course of the talk, with the relevant links, of course. And we'll work our way through the questions that we unfortunately haven't managed to answer, and we will put that in due course on the JCT website, the commercial part of the website, not the product part of the website. So please do remember to register if you haven't already for our newsletter, and you'll be informed of when that post-lecture feedback goes online. Thank you very much.